Welcome back, it's Hermine. I've got a new question for today's third episode on security. What if we had to find our own critical raw materials here in Europe? Critical materials, especially rare earths, have recently become a hot topic in international diplomacy. Everyone's trying to get their hands on these tiny elements. That's why, for example, American President Donald Trump has been putting pressure on Ukraine and Greenland to let industries in the US access these critical mineral resources. So, what exactly are these rare earths, and why are they so important? And so far, who's got their hands on them and who's calling the shots? You just can't create new technologies without the right critical materials. They're essential for making your smartphone, for instance. The battery's got lithium and cobalt. The screen and speakers have rare earth elements. And the casing and internal components that handle things like vibration have nickel and magnesium. Electric cars and soon self-driving cars, as well as artificial intelligence like robots, also depend on them. And they're closely tied to the other two parts of our security, the ones I talked about in my first two episodes. First, there's defense. We use them in equipment like fighter planes, drones and missiles. And then energy. You'll find them in green technologies like wind turbines and solar panels, technologies crucial for our energetic transformation. So we'll need more of these materials in the future. But the problems are that they're either hard to find or come from just a few places, and their supply chains are also pretty fragile. Also, there aren't many options for easily replacing them. It's pretty clear that not all countries are equally well endowed when it comes to raw materials, and Europe is not exactly holding all the cards here. China's got almost half of the world's reserves and has got a big say in these supply chains. Brazil, India and Australia are next in line. And when it comes to how much of these rare earths can be processed around the world, it's China again that's number one, as it's got close to 90% of the global processing. And Beijing isn't shy about reminding everyone of this. It's already restricted the export of some of these critical elements, such as in April, in retaliation to Trump's tariffs on China. As you can see, this is a fragile situation, and it has led the European Union to want to be more self-sufficient on that front. What would this look like for Europe? Nikos Vetas, who's a professor of economics at the Athens University of Economics and Business, tries to answer this question in an interview with Nikos and Mariana on Sky Radio.
What could strategic autonomy mean? Doing everything on our own in Europe. Yes, we could do that, but it would definitely come at a cost. You can't have your cake and eat it too. We often have to make choices, and I believe that's exactly what we need to do here. We need to create diversification so that we don't rely on imports that all come from a single region of the world or from a single economy, with which we might fall out at some point in the future, even if that future is 10, 20 or 30 years from now.
Since May 2024, the EU has its own Critical Raw Materials Act, a law through which the bloc is trying to protect its economy and achieve autonomy by making the supply chain more independent. This means finding more suppliers so that the EU won't rely too much on one country. The plan is that by 2030, no country will provide more than 65% of any of the ores and materials we need. And as soon as these materials are available in our markets, we'll do our best to make them more circular. This means making sure we use them for as long as possible and recycle them. European Commission spokesperson Lea Zuber told our colleague Jean-Claude, a journalist at Luxembourg's Radio 100.7, that the EU is trying its best to make up for lost time.
We have already signed 14 partnership agreements, including with Ukraine, as I mentioned. But there is also Canada, Argentina, Australia, Serbia, and the list goes on. Of course, we are also working to develop sites in Europe because we have raw materials such as lithium and rare earths here. We are working to further develop the sites, I know there are projects in Estonia, France, Sweden, Spain and Greece.
Back in June 2025, Brussels put out its first list of 13 strategic projects, all of which are located outside the EU for the extraction, processing, recycling or substitution of rare earth. In an interview with Auguste from Lithuanian radio station Žinių radijas, Žygimantas Maurikas, chief economist at the Luminor Bank, says that the EU should think bigger and faster.
There are opportunities out there. There is Poland, there is Sweden, there is Norway, there are other countries where a lot can be done. There is potential in Africa because Africa is largely ignored by the United States, and China may not yet have the same presence in all countries. There are countries out there where the potential could be better exploited. It is just a matter of creating coalitions and investing internally. We need to wake up now, because otherwise there will be challenges to our competitiveness.
And he adds that this is all the more urgent now, given the challenges we are facing in defense.
There is one further element that is perhaps not fully understood, that at any moment, whether triggered by the outbreak of a more direct military conflict or the escalation of the trade war, China and even the US may limit the export of their raw materials to other countries, to the global market. If this happens, Europe will be left with slim pickings and probably at significantly higher prices, which will harm competitiveness.
In fact, if we didn't have enough supplies, we'd have major problems with our defense systems. Just think about what will happen. We'd be without high-strength components in aircraft and armored vehicles, without guidance system and communication devices in planes and drones, and so on. This would put us in a really critical position. The second part of the EU's plan is really about mining our own resources. Under the Critical Raw Materials Act, the goal is for at least 10% of what the bloc uses each year to come from local extraction, local mining, 40% to be processed within the EU, and a quarter to come from recycling. Maeve Rutte, the Deputy Director at the European Commission DG GROW, which handles industry and other things, says they've taken a few steps to meet the first of these targets. She's interviewed by our Estonian colleague Mart at Kuku Radio.
Over the past 3 or 4 years, we have launched mineral resource studies to examine many mines that have already been shut down. Because if coal was mined there in the past, there is a good chance that there are other significant mineral resources there today that we have not explored or did not need before. Actually, we have some of these resources here in Europe. They are not that rare, but the challenge is that deposits aren't usually very concentrated, so they're hard to find. That's why they're often found by chance, when other minerals and ores are being extracted.
Actually, we have some of these resources here in Europe. They aren't that rare, but the challenge is that deposits aren't usually very concentrated, so they're hard to find. And that's why they're often found by chance, when other minerals and ores are being extracted.
This has actually led to the emergence of a number of projects looking to extract Europe's own mineral resources, either from tailings or from existing mines. This is a big challenge, to make better use of existing resources, including those that have already been extracted, and to put them to use in a new economy based on renewable energies and renewable materials.
In early 2025, 47 strategic projects have been approved within the EU, in addition to the 30 non-EU projects mentioned above, and more are to come. But are Europeans really ready to open new mines? Getting several million tons out of the ground while keeping the environmental impact to a minimum is a tricky business. So confirms Eric Birard, a professor of mineral resources at Liège University, in an interview with Belgian colleague Miriam from RTBF.
I don't want to talk about a clean mine because I think that digging a hole in whatever way has an impact on the environment and that any human activity has an impact on the environment. So it all comes down to how well we control that impact. The engineers who work in mining are trained in the same schools as the engineers who make the rockets that go to Mars. I think we have both the technological skills and the environmental skills. But I repeat, it's a challenge to get several million tons out of the ground with the least possible impact.
Diversifying and sourcing locally will help, but it's not the whole solution. Even China could run out of its own reserves, experts warn, so we should expect global shortages down the line. That's why recycling is the third big avenue in the EU's plan. Remember, recycling should be able to provide 25% of the bloc's annual needs. Let's listen to French expert Carl Greco on this. He's interviewed by Tamara at Euradio.
Recycling is potentially a very promising option because it generates less pollution and requires less energy than primary production. However, recycling still raises a number of questions and difficulties. The first question is about how much money there is to invest in recycling facilities, which can be a heavy investment when we're talking about collecting, sorting, treating, and processing minerals. Plus, recycling requires constantly adapting to different technologies, which limits the prospects for recycling a lot of different materials, at least for now.
There are many logistical hurdles in the cycle, says Francisco Ferreira, environmentalist and president of Portugal Zero Association, an organization that promotes sustainability-related actions and projects. He talks about the difficulties in organizing the collection of goods for recycling in an interview with our colleague Alexandre at Radio Renascença.
One of the stumbling blocks is that there's no money for me to ensure a door-to-door collection. And it's only through collecting this waste that we can generate some cash with which to effectively implement these policies.
The EU faces a lot of hurdles on the way to becoming more circular. For example, not enough attention goes into circularity when products are designed. On top of that, there's little information about what products are actually made of. Collection and recycling rates are still low. Recycling facilities and technologies aren't keeping up, and overall resource use remains very intensive. The European Environment Agency recently published a report that says we're way behind where we need to be to meet the EU's 2030 circularity target, especially since things have not gotten better in the last 5 years. The report suggests some steps related to production and demand, among other things. Romanian MEP Nicolae Ștefănuța from the Greens Group explains.
I get that we need to set up a whole production chain here. There's no sense in starting production if you don't have a market, distributors, marketing, buyers, and so on, upstream and downstream. You have to create a whole market, not just part of it. And that's exactly what these objectives aim to do, create a market.
EU countries are still failing to exploit the potential of recovering secondary rare materials through recycling. We've got all the tech we need to make this happen, but we're still waiting for that big breakthrough. Until then, manufacturers can't collect enough devices to sort and recycle them. So when I look at things, I would say that the EU's got a bunch of good ideas for making sure we've got a steady supply of critical minerals. The critical material law was a bit of a slow burner, and it's had its fair share of bumps in the road since it was put into action. But if we wait any longer to act, the EU's economic future could hang in the balance. Thanks for listening. In the next 3 episodes, we're going to take a look at what role the European Union could play in the world in the future. We're getting smaller in terms of demographics and the economy, and new powers are emerging. So what's in it for us? If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to leave a rating and review on the platforms where you listen.